we're seeing that the US military isn't ready and is still moving forces into the region. So we're still actually on high tension, and this is going to explode quite literally at some point in the near future.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
The deepening ties between China, Russia and North Korea would certainly have some in Washington concerned.
And then Daddy has to sometimes do strong language too.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper and judicious transition.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battle Lines, the Telegraph's foreign policy and defence podcast. It's Monday, February the 2nd, 2026. Last week, Donald Trump moved a beautiful armada, including the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, towards Iran in preparation for massive airstrikes to punish the Iranian regime for the massacre of thousands of protesters last month.
We have a large armada, flotilla, you can call it whatever you want, heading toward Iran right now, even larger than what we had in Venezuela. But we're now sending actually a larger number of ships to Iran, and hopefully we'll make a deal. If we do make a deal, that's good. If we don't make a deal, we'll see what happens.
Here at the Telegraph, and I assume in newsrooms across Fleet Street, we're on standby for our weekends to be interrupted if the Americans dropped a bomb on Ayatollah Khamenei. It didn't happen. This morning we were told that the Americans and the Iranians are locked in serious talks to avert a war. Mr. Trump seems to have pivoted from regime change to using his armada as leverage for a new nuclear deal. We'll be looking at how that diplomacy is progressing and whether the threat of war has passed. Meanwhile, inside Iran, political fractures over the killings are widening, with reformers distancing themselves from the government. And as the internet blackout lifts, Iranians outside the country are beginning to learn just what happened to their friends and relatives. How many people killed, how many people survived, and what happened to those who were wounded. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Sascha Bruchmann, a research fellow for defence and military analysis at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Telegraph's foreign correspondent, Akhtar Makoii. I began by asking Sascha to summarise where he thinks the military standoff is today.
I don't think the threat of war has passed yet. I'm of the view, watching how the military buildup has played out over the last couple of weeks, we've seen capabilities rushing into the region, but not at the capacity that would be needed. And thus, as we have been counting and trying to count, how many air squadrons have moved, how many destroyers, how many air wings or how many air squadrons are on the Abraham Lincoln, and what damage could they do, and where are the bombers? My conclusion still is we're still in heightened tension. The threat of war, of airstrikes against the regime, Khamenei decapitation, or against wider elements of the regime, such as the IGC, has not passed. And we're still in the phase of military buildup.
And Akhtar, I know you've been looking at what's been happening inside Iran and getting a sense of the voices emerging. Could you just give us a sense of how that picture is becoming clear and what is the latest from the ground inside the country?
Yeah, as you said, internet is slowly restoring across the country, and we are seeing a more clear picture of the massacre and its aftermath. And across the country, in every corner of Iran, now we are seeing footage and clips are coming up. We see lots of people, thousands of those young people are getting buried in Iran. And there is a common sense of sadness across the country. And the languages are still threatening from the Islamic Republic official. We had the Armed Forces Chief of Staff today saying, okay, we have changed our defensive doctrine to offensive, ready to war with Iran. Khamenei was saying yesterday, any war with Iran would be a regional conflict. The language is still threatening, and we are seeing more clips, more information, more details about what happened on January 9 and 8.
Thank you, Akhtar. We'll come back to that. And I do want to share some testimony that's been shared with me from eyewitnesses from the massacre, which is pretty extraordinary stuff. Let's start then with the big geopolitical scene then. Sascha, you said that you don't believe we're out of the woods. The threat of war or the threat of a decapitation strike is still there. However, the Americans are now seem to be offering the regime a new nuclear deal instead. What do you think is the calculation and the rationale behind that?
The Americans for the last couple of weeks have told the regime that they want a new nuclear deal. Better than, for Trump, this one has to be better than Obama's JCPOA, or for sure. But they have also linked the conventional missile program and the proxy forces, the Iranian proxies in the Middle East to that. And I think either of them or the three combined would be too much for the regime to give up. So I can't see, with also the rhetoric of the regime coming out of the last couple of weeks, that there's anyone in Tehran who is serious about giving up the nuclear program, the conventional ballistic missile program, or the proxies that they have groomed for half a century by now, almost. So I think we're seeing delaying tactics on both sides, where the Iranians are trying to find a way out to calm tensions and maybe to talk Trump off the ledge. Meanwhile, I think we're seeing that the US military isn't ready and is still moving forces into the region. So the talks and the actions on the ground, I don't think they match up. I'm worried that we're still actually on high tension and this is going to explode quite literally at some point in the near future.
Okay, so the diplomacy might just be cover, buying time while they move more forces into the region for an operation.
I think everyone is serious in trying to explore what is possible, but ultimately the positions are so far apart that at some point there will be I think Trump will make the determination that there's no sense in talking to the regime, as in the regime will not give up what he needs them to give up. And therefore, at some point, he'll come to the conclusion that violence is on the table again.
I just want to explore this because if he's asking them to give up their nuclear program, that kind of suggests that the bombing campaign last summer, which we're told just wrecked their main nuclear facilities, wasn't that successful. Therefore, there's still things for the Iranian regime to give up. Or it was completely wrecked, but this is just some kind of gambit. For some other reason, the Trump administration wants to offer this diplomatic opportunity. I'm wondering if you have any view on that and what we know about what condition the nuclear program is in. Does it still exist in any serious form?
I don't know for sure where the nuclear program stands. I think what we need to keep in mind, last year with Midnight Hammer, we were only talking about the tip of the pyramid. So we're talking about the three installations, Isfahan, Fordow, and Natanz, with Fordow being the one that everybody talked about with the bunker busters, with the massive ordnance penetrator. I think what was largely overlooked is also how much of, let's say, that nuclear industrial base was actually destroyed during the 12-day war. So from facilities that make carbon fiber heat-resistant materials to the facilities that make some of the Iranian centrifuges, they were all hit, they were all struck. Now, my personal assessment, I know this has been hotly debated and disputed, is that nuclear program has taken some serious setbacks, but it's in a state where with enough time and money, the Iranians could restore it. And I think that is what is currently on the table diplomatically.
It's so difficult to marry these two parts of the story. On the one hand, you've got this international tensions and Trump's talking about the nuclear program again. And at the same time, there's this domestic thing going on in Iran. And it's just getting those two things.
Maybe think of that also, that there's a geopolitical opportunity. It is not just the risk of war, but if you're a planner in the White House or in the Pentagon, or even in Tel Aviv right now, right? This is the opportunity to reverse the geopolitics of the Middle East, to flip it. It has been as it is for the last 55 years. If Iran's regime were to fall, an entirely new geopolitical landscape emerges in the Middle East, and you will weigh these risks versus the opportunity of becoming that president who has made that possible, right? Iran, since 1979, it started with the hostage crisis. Hezbollah burst into activity in 1982 by blowing up the US embassy. And from there on, we've had conflict ever since. And the entire geopolitical landscape is divided in that conflict, with the Iranians trying to, in their mind, I think, kick out the Americans and kill the Israelis, because that's what they think are the impediments to controlling the Middle East. A different regime would mean there are other opportunities for alliances and a completely new geopolitical structure in that. And that's, I think, also what people in the White House and in the Pentagon will be weighing.
So that moment of opportunity is still there. That temptation to try to do something really grandiose has not gone away.
Well, the opportunity is still there, because now you have to sync your military action with the protest. That is a difficult one. But can you resist that? That temptation, as you say, is there.
Akhtar, is this a kind of conversation that's going on in Iran? They do worry about regime change. What can you tell us about the regime's attitude to all of this, the view from Tehran on this?
The view from Tehran, every time there are some protests or there's any threat coming from inside or outside the country, and when the regime survives, it feels more powerful. The crackdown would be even more severe. And you just talked about the foreign threats that the Islamic Republic has to deal with, the Americans and everything, but the Islamic Republic also has to deal with something else inside the country. The reformists and its former president Hassan Rouhani, who was a president for 8 years, and then before that for 16 years, he was the Secretary of Supreme National Security Council. He's directly criticizing the Islamic Republic's policies. He said there is a big change that is needed to be done by the authorities to listen to the people's demands. And his remarks were criticized again by hardliner politicians.
This is what over the weekend?
Yeah, on Saturday. And then a hardliner MP said, okay, the biggest change, the best change the Islamic Republic can have is to arrest Hassan Rouhani and execute him. And also on the front, the reformist front, where Hassan Rouhani is coming from, their spokesperson said over the weekend that they can no longer justify the Islamic Republic crackdown, and they are distancing themselves from what the Islamic Republic did during the last month's protests. And also the other ones, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Karoubi, the leaders of Green Movement in 2009, after the 2009 protests, they are also speaking out over the past few days.
These are the guys under house arrest or in Evin prison.
Yeah, Mir Hossein has been under house arrest, Mir Hossein Mousavi, since 2011, and Mehdi Karoubi was released conditionally last year. So they both said, Mr. Karoubi said Ayatollah Khamenei has, he is to be blamed for what the country is going through now. And Mir Hossein Mousavi asked on armed forces to lay down their guns against the people. So there is a sense of cracks within we can't really say the reformists are a part of the Islamic Republic, because they have been pushed since, after Rouhani was the president, they have been pushed aside, and they were disqualified from running for parliament, for president, until Pezeshkian won. So there is this sense of cracks that are beginning to appear within the Islamic Republic.
But this is a movement that's already kind of marginalized within the political landscape.
And they're still now trying to distance from themselves from the regime's crackdown on protesters.
Sascha there was talking about the great temptation before the Americans and the Israelis that actually maybe we could get rid of the Islamic Republic. This could be an opportunity and so on. And yet at the same time, the Americans are putting this proposal on the table, come to the table, give up your nuclear program, limit your missiles. Yeah. I suppose if I was Ali Khamenei, if I was in his position, I think I'd probably take that deal, because my nuclear program's just been pulverized. I can't make a bomb soon anyway. It would take a long time to restore it. And I would get sanctions relief with that, which means I would guarantee the survival of the Islamic Republic for many years, because I would get a flood of money. Shouldn't he just take this deal? Will he take this deal?
No. I mean, you said...
You say no.
Yeah, you said...
He won't.
No, Khamenei's mindset is a revolutionary mindset. If he comes to the deal with Americans, any sort of deals, which he has been talking against it for decades, it would show his weakness, his regime's weakness, and it is not what he would like to portray to his supporters. There might be some back-channel talks through the Arabs in the Persian Gulf or through, I don't know, to anyone else, but officially, on state television, on TV, Khamenei is not going to come and acknowledge any deal. He was criticizing for years that 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and he has always pushed the government, any government power in Tehran, any administration, whether it's a reformist or it's hardliner, to not talk to him, to not trust Americans. And he's now in a weaker position than previously, of course, but he wouldn't still go directly talk to Americans and say, okay, now let's have a deal, let's have a handshake. A handshake with Americans is not something Khamenei would like you to see. There might be in the background in some way.
Right. So even though giving up the nuclear program means giving up something that is basically a wreck anyway.
Yeah, that's like giving up the nuclear program, giving up missile program. That's the face of the Islamic Republic. They won't just come and say, okay, we won't have anything with nuclear. We won't enrich uranium at any level. That's what Trump wants. And we won't have missiles, which that means that's the end of the Islamic Republic, that revolutionary ideology of making the White House a Hosseini.
Even if it means sanctions relief, which would mean a lot of money, it would mean kind of making your population happier, and it would mean more cash for the regime. Yeah, but probably survival.
Yeah, but Khamenei is not Khomeini to drink the cup of poison. He may at some point, if like in the background.
This is the cup of poison. This is when Ayatollah Khamenei had to sign a peace deal with Iraq at the end of the war, and he really didn't want to do it.
Yeah, so Khamenei may have to be forced through that, but he is also under pressure from a hardcore part of the IRGC to not give up anything to the Americans, because giving up even a single centrifuge in somewhere in Tehran's research center or whatever, that means, okay, we are surrendering to Americans' demand, to Trump's demand. And he was explicitly talking against that yesterday, saying, okay, what happened during last month was just a coup designed by American and Israelis. And now if you say, okay, we talked with Americans and we have a deal. He may let the foreign ministry to do it, but officially, publicly, he would be criticizing it. He would be condemning his own foreign ministry, saying, why did you okay, we had to deal with the Americans just because we were in a position to do that. He wouldn't officially say we were under pressure. He would say, Americans were keep calling us. They were begging us for a deal. But Khamenei is not a man to surrender to any American deal, to any Americans' demands, even if his regime, his survival is in danger.
That sounds like diplomacy is futile then, in a way.
Not futile. In a sense, it builds the backbone of future actions, right? So Trump can say that he tried in earnest to negotiate about these things. But yeah, I totally agree with what has just been said. Like, you can't be a revolutionary regime and at the same time relinquish the levels of power that you use to maintain influence. Ultimately, the Islamic Republic is not aspiring to just occupy Iran. Its aspiration is to be the dominant Muslim power in the world. You can't do that without the levels of power. You know, those are military proxies and potentially nuclear weapons. What if there's another crisis? Now you don't have missiles. Like right now, everybody is calculating how many destroyers, how many aircraft carriers, how many interceptors do we have in the region. If he relinquishes one of his levels of power, which are the ballistic missiles, for example, the next crisis, he'll be forced to acquiesce.
Yeah, and there is also another chance that Hassan Rouhani and Ali Larijani, they could use their influence within the office of the Islamic Republic, supremely within the office of Ali Khamenei, to convince him to give up something, whatever. Not like just completely stopping enrichment, but there is always a chance of Hassan Rouhani and Ali Larijani using their influence to soften the regime's language and trying to interact with Washington. They tried that in June war. Both people are mainly not concerned about the Islamic Republic's survival. They might be, but they're more concerned about their own their own life post-Khamenei, whenever Khamenei dies. So Rouhani would like to be the supreme leader. He has no chance at the time we are talking. But when you are talking, and Larijani, at the same, he wants to keep his family's roots and influence. We shouldn't forget that Larijanis have a very big influence within the Islam. The family has a very big influence within the regime. And if he wants to use that influence to interact with Americans, that could be an option. But convincing Khamenei to talk to Americans to relinquish anything is a hard job.
Coming up, as Tehran lifts its internet blackout, Iranians abroad are beginning to learn just what happened to their friends and family at home. Who died, who was arrested, and who survived. Keep listening for some of their stories. Welcome back. You're listening to Battle Lines, the Telegraph's foreign policy and defence podcast with me, Roland Oliphant. In the studio with me is our foreign correspondent, Akhtar Makoii, and on the line is Sascha Bruchmann of the International Institute of Strategic Studies. We're talking about Iran. I want to bring up what's happening to ordinary Iranians just now, and the reason is an Iranian contact of mine has just been in touch with people on the ground, sending voice notes, and she shared several with me. I'm just going to read out verbatim. I'll let it speak for itself. So this is the account of a 23-year-old man. By his account, it was his mother's birthday, and he had gone to the shop to pick up a cake when he walked into protests. I'm not sure exactly in which town this is. And this is what he said. The smell of blood was everywhere. I saw a father on his knees trying to keep his son alive. I stepped forward to help. I felt like someone kicked my leg. I turned my head and saw my leg wasn't there anymore. It was just hanging by a strip of skin below the knee. I collapsed onto the body of the boy. A security officer stood over me, looking down. "You're still alive," the officer asked. He was then thrown into the back of a van with dead bodies. I was struggling to breathe under the weight of the bodies. Every now and then I'd hear a moan from the pile. I still hear these moans today in that half-awake state between dreams and reality. At the hospital, a nurse noticed him, that he was breathing. She whispered to him, "Don't say anything, let them think you're dead." She tied a tourniquet, zipped him into a body bag and sent him to the morgue. And again, his voice, "I don't know how long I was in there in the cold among the dead. I would lose consciousness and wake up until I felt them moving me. When security units had finally cleared out of the hospital, the staff retrieved him and hid him in the maternity ward, the only place they thought the regime wouldn't look for a wounded man. They amputated my leg there," he says. "I left the house to buy my mother a birthday cake. I never made it back home." This is just one bit of eyewitness testimony which came out, I was told, literally on Saturday night as the internet opened up. Akhtar, what do you make of that? Does that match with what you're hearing?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like now internet is slowly restoring. It's not fully restored yet. And you see like now the full scale of the massacre, the full scale of the crackdown is getting more clearer. And as I said, like every corner of Iran, there is a shared sense of sadness and like grief across the country. There were comedy shows on private platforms. They would release an episode every week, like once a week. And they all stopped. And with all of this, you would assume that the state television would also be like in like moment of sadness or grief or whatever, but it was not. Over the weekend on a state television program on Ufuk channel, a presenter mocked the protesters, the dead protesters, and which sparked a public anger. The channel's director was sacked. The channel itself, the judiciary filed a case against it. And it's just against what's going on in the country, which is just, if you open Iranian social media, you would just see these these young faces dancing, like enjoying their life, and now they're dead. So it's a shared sense of sadness across the country.
There are a lot of numbers being thrown around, and I'm kind of loath to cite them because they seem so unreliable. But do we have any idea how many thousands of people were killed?
I mean, the Islamic Republic says 3,117. In reaction to this state television program, a newspaper affiliated with Imam Reza Shrain's, the Astan Quds Razavi in Mashhad, had a opinion piece today about it, saying, okay, if the regime is saying 3,000 people are killed, and if the oppositions are saying 30,000, the number is between 3,000 and 30,000. And we had like several of them. All of them were, whether they were protesters, whether they were security forces, they were Iranians. They were trained within the Ministry of Education of Iran. In the state media, even those who are very close to the regime, they're also giving you that 30,000 number and 3,000 number. So
it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot.
All we know is it's a lot.
Yeah, it's thousands, like unprecedented within the Islamic Republic's history or in the Iranian history. Previous protests, we would have like 500 numbers, 1,500, 300. But now we are talking about something between 3,000 to 30,000. Which is unprecedented.
It's unprecedented.
Yeah.
Sascha, everything that Akhtar's just said and what we're hearing from the ground, which is horrific. And then there seems to be this kind of quite esoteric discussion on the outside about numbers of missiles or uranium enrichment and so on. Do you think the situation on the ground really cuts through to the Western decision makers, like to Donald Trump and so on? Or do you think he's just not interested in that subject? I'm finding it very difficult to balance this because there seem to be almost two conversations going on.
Look at how hard it was to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization now in the European Union, how some countries were not in agreement until very, very recently, until like 3 days ago, right? It's only just recently happened. I think the debate in the UK is turning the same way. Watching protests in so many towns, seeing the violence and the crackdown in so many different towns in each of the 31 provinces, I find it hard to believe that it's only 3,100. I would say it's plausible that the number is actually much higher. But you're right, it's a bit of an esoteric discussion on numbers, either of missiles, highly enriched uranium, how many killers, or how many people were killed. They were slaughtered in the streets. I think, unfortunately, on balance, we're in a different world order right now. And what Trump, the White House, the Pentagon, Foggy Bottom will care about is the larger geopolitical framework. And that's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea is a fragile, but it's an alliance system. Iran has positioned itself as an enemy of the United States, as an enemy of Israel, and as an impediment to U.S. stability and security in the world. And there's a spoiler that always draws American military assets back from the Indo-Pacific and into the Middle East. And that is on the long term not sustainable. I think, unfortunately, it's the colder geopolitical assessments that will influence the decision-making, rather whether it's been 3,000 or 30,000 people that have been killed in the street.
You were talking about how you were, I'm kind of going back to the outside esoteric discussion of numbers of tanks and jet fighters and so on, but you were talking about, counting air defense systems and ships and so on. Could you give us a sense of what the Americans have got in the region? You think that there's still a chance of military action? If so, what do we think that looks like?
I think capabilities have moved in, but capacity is still too low. We have seen over the last couple of years that Central Command, so the US command responsible for the Middle East, has been thinned out to about 30 to 40,000 soldiers, largely being kind of what we say fitted to receive those forces that are actually the air wings, the air squadrons, the ships, and the air defense systems. So they always have to be rushed in. And that's also what we saw in 2024. Actually, already October 7, you saw the first thing the Americans sent was an aircraft carrier. Maybe as a point of comparison, if you think about last year, June war, I think there were 5 missile destroyers alone on the eastern Mediterranean rim, so protecting Israel, 5 Aegis-class destroyers. There were several in the Red Sea. There were 2 aircraft carrier groups, 2 carrier strike groups in the Western Indian Ocean. Right now, we only have 1 carrier strike group. So this is always the first thing that US presidents rush to. The Abraham Lincoln has several air squadrons on. 1 is an F-35 squadron, so 10 to 12 planes. 3 are F-18s. And then there's 1 EA-18 Growlers. So there's like 4 strike squadrons and 1 that is electronic warfare that would help with the radars, basically kicking in the door, so to speak. That is not enough for a sustained campaign. I actually think there will have to be some support from bombers coming from either flying from the continental United States, like we saw last year, or from Diego Garcia, which has an overlay with the discussion of the UK and the US currently about Diego Garcia's legal status and political support for this. But the main point is, all we saw last year, there was an additional battery of THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. There were additional Patriots. There were these 5 destroyers just to protect Israel. That just gives you an idea what is needed to defend a country that has its own integrated air defense system with Arrow 3, Arrow 2, David Sling, and as a last resort, Iron Dome. And still, interceptors were running low towards the end. I think it's an underappreciated element to the end of the conflict in June. Now, the Islamic Republic has fewer of these long-range missiles that can reach Israel than it has of the shorter-range missiles that can reach American bases on the Gulf and can hit American allies, Gulf allies. So the threat is actually bigger now if the Iranian regime thinks it's end time. It would lash out against allies, oil infrastructure, and American interests in the region, and it has more missiles at its disposal. Against Israel, the estimates vary quite a bit, but let's say 500 plus were fired or made it to Israel. Probably about 1,000 were kind of lost because the Israelis also took out some of the launchers on the ground. 500 made it to Israel last year during war, and 50, just under 50, had effect in Israel. That's an 80 to 90% intercept range. I don't think we'll see the same thing here with the shorter range ballistic missiles. So you need more and more assets, and there's just not the amount of destroyers with that Aegis system. There's just not enough air squadrons. There's just not enough THAAD and Patriots in this area right now.
Realistically, we're a long way off military action or offensive military action.
This can rush in a very short time, but yeah, it's just not, the math doesn't math right now.
The Iranians announced over the weekend that they would hold live fire exercises in the Strait of Hormuz. They appear to have cancelled that now, but closing that strait has always been something of a metaphorically nuclear option for them. Is shutting down that key oil artery something you think they would contemplate?
I think the exercises were not only live fire exercises. There was also an element of, they were supposed to be in coordination with Russian and Chinese armed forces, which if you think where the most likely location of the carrier is, would probably also be interesting because maybe Russian Chinese ships would be able to spot the carrier. Then they were cancelled after, I think, CENTCOM had a very interesting tweet out saying any unprofessional behavior will basically be interpreted as a hostile act and will fire upon you. There was any close overflights, any rapid approaches, by speedboats towards our ships or something like that will be interpreted as if you were going. So there was CENTCOM actually raised the temperature there, and I think that actually deterred them because in the end, the option for the Iranian Navy is a very asymmetric force of mostly smaller boats. They can attack civilian ships, but they cannot stand against the US Navy for any meaningful time. Their best option is to mine the Strait of Hormuz because it's basically 2 narrow lines, I think 2 nautical miles wide or something like that. And then clearing the mines would take a long time, long enough to upset global oil markets. It wouldn't be, to play with the word nuclear option, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But it would be long enough probably to cause quite a bit of upheaval in global stock markets. Inflation might spike, all of the stuff that Western capitals would not like to see. But the price would probably be the destruction of the Iranian Navy. So this is a one-off in multiple ways. And I think the regime would only go with that if it thought it were falling, if it felt it would be terminally threatened.
I think I read somewhere that Iranian oil exports themselves rely pretty heavily on the Straits of Hormuz.
Yes, and it goes to China. So, if you're in Washington again, the Iranians are threatening their own oil exports to your other adversary, while you're producing more oil now than you've ever done before. We're actually at the point where US oil producers stop because the price is down by $60 per barrel, where some of their profits are going down. So we're in a vastly different world from 20 years ago when you would think of, no blood for oil, Iraq 2003. We're in a complete reversed situation right now. The Iraqi, Iranian, Kuwaiti oil goes to China, to the geopolitical adversary.
I'm losing count of the weeks. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, Donald Trump said in a statement to Iranian protests, "Stay on the streets, help is on the way," which many people believed meant intervention. It didn't happen then, didn't happen that weekend, it hasn't happened this weekend. Sascha just described why we're not even, they don't have the forces in place to act now. I'm wondering if Iranians feel that they've been led up the garden path a bit by Donald Trump.
Yeah, they pretty much do. We spoke with several of them, several protesters who are inside Iran and many who are crossing across the border into Turkey. They said Trump has blood on his hands because they were encouraged by the US president to go on the streets, and former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi was encouraging protests to go and attack regime's propaganda centers. So they're both men. Iranian protesters, many protesters are now saying they should also be blamed for the thousands who were killed. And when we look at the moment, the Islamic Republic survived again, and any strikes, whether it's on nuclear side, whether it's just killing the supreme leader, would not change the regime in Iran. It would just spark another civil war, worse than what happened in Syria and Libya. Because what Iranians are saying, they said, okay, first, like we saw during the June war, that many regime opponents who don't like the regime would, when there is a foreign intervention, they would be supporting the regime. We saw that in June. And now what they say, okay, if there is a foreign intervention, any opposition group that comes should have a international support, should have a 5-year plan for what they would do on the morning after the Islamic Republic, and that should have a support like from within the country. Because if just imagine right now Khamenei or the regime just collapses, so what comes up the next morning in Tehran? So for now, as we are seeing, as we are looking at it, the Islamic Republic has survived. There is a famous story in Shahnameh, the Persian book of kings. In that story, there is a king called Zahak who ruled the world for 1,000 years. It was brutal. Now some protesters are comparing. Zahak had 2 snakes coming out of his shoulders, and he would feed them with the brains of young men to survive, because otherwise the snakes would eat him. So now many supporters are comparing Khamenei to Zahak, just using killing young people to survive. What changed Zahak was someone called Kaveh, the goldsmith, who rose against the brutality of Zahak and went and find someone whose fathers were previous king, and then they started rebellion against the Zahak and toppled them. At the moment, every single Iranian who came out to call for a change is a Kaveh, but we need a unifying figure Kaveh the goldsmith that every single Iranian supports.
The narrative that we're hearing is that Reza Pahlavi is that figure.
No, he
You
is
don't believe
not.
he's not?
He
You don't
is
believe
not.
he is?
Definitely not even close to it. He is not. Maryam Rajavi is not.
I just think, to be fair, I think we need to make a distinction here. So
Yeah.
we're not saying that they are one and the same thing. So
No.
Maryam Rajavi of the MEK,
Yeah.
very separate to the
Yeah.
to Reza Pahlavi's kind of monarchist movement.
Yeah.
They don't like each other.
No.
And I think it's fair in saying that most Iranians will have more time for Reza Pahlavi, whereas Maryam Rajavi is regarded as basically a terrorist.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah. We both agree on that. But the Islamic Republic would be in power until there is that one unifying figure, Kaveh the goldsmith, to rise up against the Islamic Republic with a less foreign intervention. So Iranians historically do not like foreign intervention. They would like to change things by themselves, but they need that Kaveh the goldsmith.
I totally agree. It's interesting to think about what would need to happen for the regime to fall first and foremost, right? Because we're talking now already after the fact, the civil war or something. I haven't seen any meaningful defections inside. So there were incidents, like individuals who might have defected from the police, or there were these two guys in the subway who were supposed to be Atesh. But I was watching very, very closely and trying to find anything on defections within the Artesh. So for the viewers, then the regular conventional military force that is largely made up of conscripts, but historically speaking, the remnants of the Shah's army that wasn't trusted. And the IRGC is kind of the counter coup force to that. And I haven't seen anything. And that's kind of what worries me. First and foremost, now Trump is too late. It's out of sync. Secondly, I also think a decapitation strike might not get the people back on the street for various reasons, including the external interference. And third, I doubt that there's enough defections and that the level of friction in the regime, there is friction, but that level crosses the threshold where we're talking regime disintegration. And you would need to see, I think, people with guns turning against the Islamic Republic. I don't think it's in the IRGC because they are the ones who are, so to speak, in the money and whose life would be upended if the regime falls. But I also didn't see anything in the Faraja, so the uniformed police forces, or in the Atesh, the regular armed forces. And that's kind of what worries me.
That is, unfortunately, all we have time for in this edition of Battle Lines. Thank you to Sascha Bruchmann at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the Telegraph's foreign correspondent, Akhtar Makoii. Tune in on Wednesday for Battle Lines Global Health with Venetia Rainey and Arthur Scott Geddes. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.